My name's Jessica Ferracci. I'm a family medicine physician and primary care doctor practicing here in Maine, and I'm here today to talk to you about lead poisoning. Lead poisoning is a very important topic, and believe it or not, I didn't learn a ton about it in medical school. Most of it I actually learned from a personal case, the case of my 1-year-old son when he got poisoned when we moved to Maine. But more on that later. So our objectives for today are to learn about lead poisoning, to learn about the case of a lead poisoned child, my own, and then also to learn about resources. What do you do if you actually have a lead poisoning case? But first, let's take a look at what lead looks like. So lead is actually a metal, and this metal can be found naturally in the earth, but in very trace amounts. You don't get lead poisoning just from being outside touching a rock. However, if you take that lead and you mine it and turn it into ore and then start using it in industry, you can concentrate that lead into dangerous levels, as it is a potent toxin to the human body. Here you can see lead in its original form in the rocks, and then you can also see lead in its mineral form where it's been mined and concentrated into something that can be smelted and used. So we now know that lead is in rocks, but it's also, as I hinted before, very commonly used in industry. Here's some photos of some things very commonly found to have lead even today. Lead paint, although it was banned in the 1970s, is still found pretty commonly, especially in old or flaking paint from old places. Stained glass making often uses lead. It's malleable with the glass. And you can see fishing weights are quite literally made of lead. And so you can get lead poisoning from that as well. How about this? Is this one lead? You guessed it, this is not lead. Although we call it lead, that's because the people who found graphite, which is commonly found in pencils now, thought it was lead when they first discovered it. But this is actually graphite. You cannot get lead poisoning from your pencil. Don't worry. How about this one? That's correct. Ammunition ranges do often have lead in them. It's actually from the bullets themselves. And this goes for military, personal weapons, or even the police. Most of those bullets and ammunitions have lead in them. There was a lead poisoning case here in Maine where a family, kids and adults, liked to go metal detecting. And they found an old retired ammunitions range and went metal detecting there. And just from kicking up the dust from looking for metal, they got severe cases of lead poisoning. And when the soil was investigated, it was some of the highest levels of lead they had ever seen in the state of Maine. How about this one? Is this lead? Well, obviously these are cute little animals, but these animals represent the environmental repercussions that can happen from lead poisoning. For example, those bullets that are shooting, let's say, the deer or the animals that you're hunting, animals can then eat that. California condors, which were near extinction for a while, an endangered species, were quite often dying from lead poisoning from the bullets they were eating from deer carcasses. One of the leading causes of death for the common loon is actually lead poisoning from those lead plumbing fishing weights and the fish that they eat. Same thing is true for baby harbor seals. The lead poisoning from the concentrated fish can be very toxic for them. How about this one? You guessed it, more lead. So they're getting a little better about removing lead from pottery and foodware in the US, but a lot still slips through. And anything older, certainly before the year 2000, there's a good chance it has a lead glaze on it. It's used very commonly in pottery and such. There are many cases of lead poisoning from this. A couple cases from Maine involve earthen pottery that poisoned the entire family as they were all drinking from it, Thanksgiving dinners, that sort of thing. The coffee table you see in one of those photos was a lead poisoning case just recently from my colleague who had a 1-year-old and had this beautiful table that she just bought a few years ago. Turns out it was from the Philippines where they were still using lead paint. Even though it was a new table from a new store, it still had lead paint on it. And you never know. Most of you have probably heard of the Flint, Michigan water crisis. This was a problem where they diverted and started getting water source from a different place, and then the lead in the pipes was released, and the entire town, city really, had lead poisoning for quite a while, and it was quite a disaster in how they handled it. Again, most of us have learned from this crisis that water can also contain lead and poison communities. You may not know that there are still a lot of lead pipes in the United States system. For example, there was a New Hampshire study just done in 2023 that showed that 30 to 40% of public schools that were tested, and they were looking at drinking fountains, actually had some level of lead in the water, and no level of lead is safe. That's a terrifying number, 30 to 40%. That picture there is from a preschool where they found lead in the drinking water there. Not to scare you even further, but did these have lead in them? Yes, they did. Most food does not have lead, but again, it is sneaking into some foods. There was a recall back in 2023 as the cinnamon that was used to make these cinnamon applesauces actually was cut with lead in a different country, and then probably for economic and cost reasons. And that led to hundreds of kids, probably more that were never detected, but hundreds that were confirmed to be positive from these applesauces. This is another one. This was a charm sold with a pair of sneakers several years ago. And unfortunately, this charm fell into the hands of a young kid who then, as kids are wont to do, accidentally swallowed it, and the kid was dead in a few days. Lead poisoning is not usually deadly that quick, but if you swallow a charm that's 99% lead, it can absolutely kill you. All right, enough horror stories. Let's go to the case. The case starts with my 1-year-old son. So when we moved to Maine, the first thing you do is you try to get a doctor. And so here he is, and that's him in the blue right there, with his 2 older sisters at his first 1-year-old checkup. And as you might know, if you have kids or grandkids or nieces or nephews, most of the doctor's visit at the age of 1 is chit-chatting about routine questions, screening questions, and then you get your shots. And one of the many questions that they ask is demonstrated here. Depending on where you live, you may or may not get these questions. Every state has different rules, but in the state of Maine and in this electronic health record, these are the 4 questions that were posed to us. And you can see my kid and my story, we all screened negative. We are not in an older home with exposure to lead paint. We do not have hobbies that expose us to lead. None of his siblings had ever had lead poisoning. So it's a 0, low risk. And in the majority of states, we would be done there. If we got screened at all, we would then not get any testing. However, we live in the state of Maine. And in the state of Maine, as well as several other states, we have universal testing. So you can see here's a map in the United States of all the states that require testing. The states in red require universal testing. That means all 1 and 2-year-olds, regardless of their risk factor, if they screen positive or negative, should be tested. My son screened negative. However, it's really important to note that lead question screenings are not that accurate. They can miss up to 20 to 50% of cases. You can see from this map, the red states are the ones that require universal testing, which means we test all 1 and 2-year-olds, while the orange states are partial screening, maybe if they're high risk or Medicaid or so on and so forth. So in most states, my son would not have been tested. Despite having the negative screener though, with us being Maine, we were tested. The map next to it that you can see is a map of where we think the lead poisoning is in the United States, looking at age of housing, lead paint, etc. And you can see that the states that have mandatory lead testing and the states that are predicted to have a large amount of lead are completely different. So really the laws are not matching up with reality here, and we are missing probably a lot of lead cases. So it is important, if you can, to think about the state that you're in and getting lead poisoning screening. Luckily, again, my son was in the state of Maine and was tested because you can see in New England, it's a blanket of red there. All 1 and 2-year-olds are screened for the most part. So they offered screening to my son, and that usually is done through the Lead Care Analyzer that you can see right there. This is a point of care test where they just prick your kid's finger right there in the visit, and within 5 minutes or so, you have an answer of whether there is lead in the blood or not. However, not all offices have that. And on that particular day, when my son was 1 year old at his 1-year-old well child check, this had not been purchased yet, or they hadn't gotten the arrangements. Long story short, they didn't have it. So they asked us to please go to the lab. Now, the lab can be a little harder to get to. Sometimes it's in the building, sometimes it's not. Sometimes they can do a point of care test, sometimes they have to do a blood draw. It kind of depends on the lab setup. In this case, the lab downstairs was closed, and so the one downtown is the one we needed to go to, and it happened to be full that day with no appointment slots. They didn't accept walk-ins. So long story short, I almost decided not to do it. I know it's a state law, but he's low risk. I'm not worried. I still don't quite know why I decided to, but I made an appointment for a few days later. I drove him in. We waited in line for 45 minutes in a busy lab. I just think of all the people who would not have had the time or resources to go do those things, but I did. And sure enough, after finally getting his blood drawn at the lab, and then a few days later, you have to wait for the results to come back when it's at the lab typically, I get a phone call from the CDC. Specifically, this is the Childhood Lead Preventioning Program, which is a subpart and funded by the CDC, but for ease during this talk, I'm going to call it the CDC. And to our horror, we found out that my son had lead poisoning with a level of 21 micrograms per deciliter. And this is an actual screenshot of the results as they came through our portal. I can tell you the emotions on that day. I was in a car, I was doing something else, I was busy, and it felt like a ton of bricks. Despite my medical training, I didn't really know how serious this was, how high this was. This isn't something that's taught very well in medical school. So this was a very scary phone call. And rushed home, and it was the middle of the summer. You can see him in this photo. He was happy, appeared completely normal. So it was really hard to reconcile, but he looks fine. What do you mean he has lead poisoning? Everything's fine. He's meeting his developmental milestones. His pediatrician said he was great. I do want to make a quick note here though. A 21, when I talked to the person on the CDC, the nurse case manager who was talking to me, one of her first statements, largely meant to reassure me, was, oh, don't worry. It's probably a false positive. This very often happens. And technically she is correct. A lot of these positives are not as bad as they look when we repeat testing. However, this isn't a false positive in that it's not a true result. This is actually a false positive in that the test is very accurate. It is detecting lead, but it usually is actually just detecting contamination on the skin. So when he was at the lab that day, you're supposed to do soap and water hand washing to remove the lead from your skin. However, in this case, they had just done an alcohol wipe quickly. And so they were picking up lead dust in his skin as well as in his blood. So again, finger stick tests have a 50 to 70 false positive rate. But again, this is usually positive. So even if a repeat is negative, you should still be worried that there is lead somewhere in their environment. Lead dust, I should mention, is extremely pervasive. There have been cases of people sitting down in their car, and then the lead dust that was on their clothes from work floating through the car, landing on the car seat, and then poisoning the kid days later. So again, soap and water and very pervasive kind of dust there. So they told me to repeat the blood work in the next few weeks. I was there just a couple days later. And although a 21 was very scary, I was reassured to see it had come down to a 7. 7's still high, don't get me wrong, but it's a little bit better than a 21, right? And that was a venous repeat. So this is not, no contamination from the skin. This is truly what is in the blood, needle directly into the vein. That's what venous means, and confirming that his lead level was a 7. Okay, so it's better, but it is real. What does this mean? Now what? Well, as most of us do, we turn to Google. But as a medical doctor, I also have a lot of medical literature at my fingertips and the knowledge to how to look at it. So I dove, as a doctor and a mom are wont to do, I went into doing some research. So first research question, what lead level actually matters? So first off, lead poisoning is a spectrum. And much like my son, most kids look completely asymptomatic. They look fine. It's why we get a lot of denial when we tell people about lead poisoning. Say, what do you mean? He looks fine. You can't have lead poisoning. So let's go through what the data actually shows. So at the lowest levels, although 0 is what we would like, we know from this large cohort data that levels around starting at 1.3, we can start to see pretty significant increases in ADHD, double the risk. We can start to see more antisocial behaviors, and you can actually lose 1 to 3 IQ points. And that's even at levels just around 1.3, maybe a little more, a little less. And you can understand why, although those are meaningful outcomes, you wouldn't know that your kid was, not as intelligent, and you wouldn't know that your kid wasn't just born with ADHD. You would think that they were just born with that. You wouldn't think that it was from lead poisoning. So that's what I mean by asymptomatic. It's just the kid is the kid. Now at levels of 5 is when you can start to lose more IQ points, maybe 5. You can start to have more significant behavioral problems, maybe acting out in school, etc. Once we start getting into the higher levels above 10, that's when we start, and especially when it's prolonged, I should add, that's when we start to see more significant developmental disabilities, missing milestones, perhaps even infertility or hearing loss, depending on the exact level and how long it's been there. At levels greater than 15, we start to see more classic symptoms that you would think of with a poisoning case. Things like kidney problems, belly pain, anemia, which is low red blood cell counts, so not having enough blood in your body, maybe being confused. There is a correlation with dementia as well. And then if you had a very high spike and it was there for quite a bit, you might even have acute vomiting or headache or fatigue if you're significantly above 15. Now, at levels greater than 45, we're getting much more serious. Not everybody, but very frequently you'll start to see a risk of seizures, and at even higher levels, maybe coma, and it's possible to even have death at that level. Urgent hospitalization is recommended if you are a level greater than 45. Like, you should not bother repeating and checking. You should go straight to the hospital, and they might do something called chelation therapy to try to get that lead out. I should note, though, that chelation therapy and most of the therapies we have do not remove lead very well from the body. It's the best we have, but it's not easy to get out of the blood immediately. Some scary facts about lead. Lead toxicity is a major risk factor for conduct disorders and criminal behaviors. When a lead poisoning case happens, there's between a 15 to 40% increase. And this isn't just on a person by person, but we have seen this replicated in various communities throughout the US and throughout the world. As lead levels spike, crime will spike thereafter. It is thought that up to 20% of ADHD cases in the US are due to some level of lead poisoning. Very scary statistic. I had no idea, did not learn that from medical school. And then, although we're talking mostly about kids, this is absolutely pertinent to adults as well. Any level above 5 in adults, in many studies over many decades, has been shown to increase your all-cause mortality, that means death from anything, by 37%. Heart problems, that's the cardiovascular outcomes, by 70%. And that ischemic heart disease, that's your classic, I'm having a heart attack, by 108%. So how is it doing this? How is lead actually poisoning? Well, first off, it's not absorbed sort of, from a distance. It's actually immediately ingested or inhaled. So if you touch lead, you can't get it. But if you then touch it to your mouth, then you can. Again, the reason that we talk mostly about kids is that they absorb much more of it. So if we both swallow a gram of lead, a kid will absorb 50% of it, an adult will only absorb 1% of it. Now, once it's in your body, this is directly damaging the DNA and the cells in our body. So this is at a molecular level. If you know any chemistry, it basically replaces calcium. That's an easy way to think of it in your body. And calcium is used everywhere, from your DNA to your cells to your brain. So it disrupts basic chemical bonds and destroys cells. And that includes brain cells, which is why a lot of the findings we saw were in the neurocognitive realm. Weakens the blood-brain barrier as well. Now, I mentioned earlier, it's hard to get out of the body, but luckily our body is clearing it naturally, just as we do any toxin. Our red blood cells only live about 120 days in our body. So lead in your blood only has about a 30-day half-life. So after 30 days, it should cut in half, then another 30 days, it should cut in half, and so on and so forth. So if you can identify and find the source of lead poisoning and remove the source of poisoning, it will clear out of your body. So most of the treatment is not about taking a medicine to get rid of it, but rather knowing where it's coming from and avoiding it. So education really is the key here. Now, if it gets into your soft tissues, that's closer to 40-day half-life, but still, again, you can clear it. Now, when you get into trouble is when it starts getting deposited in your bone. Again, our bones are made of calcium, right? So if lead starts replacing the calcium in our bones, as you are a child developing your bones and growing, then you can have that lead in your body for decades, 25-year half-life. There have been cases of geriatric patients, over the age of 65, going through osteoporosis and losing bone and releasing their old stored lead poisoning there and having a secondary case of lead poisoning, decades and decades later. So what is it actually doing in our brain? Lead poisoning is actually destroying our frontal gray matter. That's the area of our brain. It's actually all over. You can see here in the MRI, we've got gray matter and white matter. But the frontal matter is the prefrontal cortex. That's really responsible for decision-making and mood regulation. That's all that criminal behavior and developmental disability I was talking about before. We know a lot of this information from the Cincinnati Lead Study, which looked at hundreds of kids who had lead poisoning for a long time. Between 19 and 24 years old, they had an average blood level of 13. And you can see they just had, these are You may not know how to read MRIs, but you can see the atrophy in certain areas of the brain, the ventriculomegaly. This is all stuff that we see in much older brains typically. So it ages your brain faster and gives you a lot of brain damage. So no wonder criminal behavior is going to happen more often. This is another graph of just showing how pervasive this is on our function in society. So this is looking at, on the top you can see little to no blood lead levels. And then going down, blood lead levels of 1, 2, 3, or 5 all the way to 10. And you can see that reading difficulties start to happen, math difficulties start to happen, a much increased chance that you need to repeat a grade, much increased chance of committing property crime or violent crime, absences, suspensions, school crime, off the charts. And although you can, and that's what the red on there is showing, you can remediate that a bit. You can come in and try to teach and educate and remove the lead, but better yet, try to avoid the lead poisoning to begin with. We need to remove it from our society. All right, so our next research question, what is a normal level? So first off, the definition of normal has changed. So back in the 1920s, the automotive industry had a problem. It was taking off, everybody wanted cars, but there was something called engine knock. So every time you tried to put your gasoline in your car, it made loud banging noises. Very, very distracting. Nobody liked driving their cars. And so finally in the 1920s, they brought leaded gasoline to market, which completely cured engine knock. You can see this old-timey ad here showing that if you use leaded gasoline, engine knock goes away and you can drive much better. And so by the 1920s and 1930s, leaded gasoline was everywhere. And automotive drivers were happy, but unfortunately, shortly after they opened up these factories, people started mysteriously dying. And not just regular deaths, I'm talking crazy reports like factory workers screaming and jumping out windows and falling to their death kind of stuff. And when they autopsied their brains, they found plaques and tangles reminiscent to what we see in the plaques and tangles of Alzheimer's. And in their blood was astronomically high levels of lead. And so they commissioned Dr. Robert Kehoe, MD, to come and study this for them. I should note that Dr. Kehoe was being paid by the automotive industry, so he was not impartial at all. But he did set, in the 1940s, a level of 80. 80 was the level of concern. Anything above 80 we need to be worried about, and if you're under 80, you can go back to the floor and keep on working. Which is laughable, knowing what we just learned about lead poisoning, that over a 45, we send people urgently to the hospital for chelation therapy, and he called 80, up to 80, normal. Now, the industry was going forward and making more leaded gasoline. They did not want to know about any problems. Dr. Kehoe was actually found to be suppressing data, but nevertheless, the evidence mounted, and by the 1960s, Dr. Kehoe leveled it down to a 60 being the level of concern. And then every decade after that, eventually he got discredited and dismissed, and the government did find the serious case of lead poisoning everywhere and the damage it was doing. And every decade after that, in the 1970s, it was brought down to a level of 40. In the 1990s, it was brought down to a level of 10. And then in 2012, they actually changed the definition. Rather than level of concern, as they, at this point, had more than enough evidence to show that all lead was bad, they changed it to something called the blood lead reference value. So that means that if you are above that level, so in 2012 it was a 5, that means you're in the top 2.5% of poisoned kids. Just to be clear, this is different than a normal level. So in 2021, the level got down to 3.5. So if you have a kid who is a 3.6, that does not mean that they're almost normal. That means that they are in the top 2.5% of poisoned kids in the United States. This is using NHANES data, which is a national survey of the United States. Now, if there's one thing you're going to get from this talk, I want it to be this sentence. There is no known safe threshold for lead in children. And I will say that again because, again, that is the most important part of this talk. There is no known safe threshold for lead in children. 0 is the normal number. So even if it's a 1, even if it's a 1.5, even if it's a 3.4, those are all abnormal levels. It's just the degree of how abnormal it is that we should be concerned about. Now, the history of lead poisoning in the US. We had leaded gasoline for decades, as you could see from the previous slide. And when we finally started tracking this as a nation, you can see in the 1970s, the average blood lead level in the average kid, the average adult, was 15. I just want to pause for a second. If you think back a few slides ago, 15 was the level where you can start having kidney problems, high blood pressure, certainly already had developmental delays, and so on and so forth. And the average United States adult was 15. This is shocking. And it is widely now thought that when they removed lead from the gasoline, which started to happen in 1973 and was phased out over several years, you can see the lead levels plummeted, absolutely plummeted there. It is thought that removing lead from gasolines was one of the most important public health moves of the entire 20th century, and the IQ of the United States as a nation rose by several points. And you can see with every intervention after that, removing it from lead paints, removing it from plumbing, removing it from solder and food cans has lowered it even further, where the last data I looked up here was in 2016. The blood lead level was 0.7 for the average American. So again, we have made progress. It is certainly far better than 15, but I do sometimes wonder how much of the kidney disease I'm treating every day in my clinic, how much of the ADHD I'm diagnosing in my adults all the time might have actually been due to childhood lead poisoning. So back to our case. The CDC is calling me with this new level of a 7 in my son. Now, I should make a note that it depends on your state, but most states will call everybody with a level greater than 5, and they are working on trying to call everybody greater than a 3.5, that being the new blood lead reference level. Again, the CDC meaning the Childhood Lead Prevention Program. When they call you, it's mostly resources, education, and advice. I had a lot of questions for them. I had not finished all of my research by the time they called, and they gave me a lot of resources. In many states, they will actually offer home health visits where a nurse will come to your home and take a look at your child and make sure they're okay. In many states, it also cues you in for developmental services. So you can get, if your child is falling behind in developmental milestones, you can get physical therapy or occupational therapy or other services like that. You get assigned a case manager who can help call you and walk you through questions you might have or any issues that come up during the case. And they also, again, most states have resources in terms of lists of abatement contractors and other things to do about the lead poisoning. How this information looked for me was a lot of handouts. You can see it was tip sheets galore about how to clean up lead dust if you find it, how to protect your child from lead. I have to say this scared me more. Reading this tip sheet, I learned that if you have lead dust from paint and you try to vacuum up that lead dust, the lead dust will actually go through the vacuum cleaner bag, back into the air, and then settle right back down on the floor. You have to use a special HEPA vacuum filter in order to get all of that lead out of your environment. So they often recommend doing this wet cleaning, where instead of just sweeping, because again, it just moves around, you get a wet rag and then you wipe it down and throw that into a garbage. And they say if you're using a mop, the water that you're putting the mop in, you then need to flush that down the toilet. So this is all helpful information, but scary to realize how pervasive this lead dust was and where it could be in my home. They told me there's ways to check for it in your home. I went online and bought everything I could find at the time. There was a lead dust kit. I don't believe they're manufactured anymore. Those are the original lead check sticks, which were prohibitively expensive, but when you're scared, you buy anything. And you can see on one side there's a tan color that was negative for lead. And then you can see I eventually found the lead. That was the pink there. Pink turns positive for lead there. There are also lead test swabs and other things on the market now as well. But in my case, in the state of Maine, if you have a level greater than 5, they actually offer to send an investigative team to your home to try to find where the lead poisoning is coming from, because we did not have an easy answer. I did not know it was, the tablecloth or the ceramic vase or whatever it was. I looked around and couldn't find it at first. I should note that if you are a renter or renting your home or apartment, then a landlord does often have to cover the cost of abatement. And then also with my son, they recommended repeating it in 3 months to see if it was coming down and see if we actually found the source and eliminated it from his environment. And so I got to live through a CDC childhood lead program investigation, home investigation. And so they swept my home from top to bottom. You can see the investigator there. He's holding something called an XRF machine, XRF. It actually shoots a little X-ray and immediately gets it back, and within a few seconds will tell you the exact content of lead in whatever you're aiming it at. And so they have protocols where they go from room to room around the entire home and check mostly paint. They're looking for any lead paint anywhere in the home. Well, I have a big, beautiful new home that I had purchased in Maine. It was built in 2002, so I did not think there was lead paint in it. And sure enough, after doing a full sweep, they did not find any lead paint in the home either with their XRF machine. They also can use that XRF machine to point it at anything. So I gave them a bunch of toys and glassware and things that we were eating off of. They also helped me collect water samples and soil samples and dust samples. You can see in the photo right over there, the white square. The dust samples you get, and it has to be from a special kit. You wipe in a very specific pattern and then put the wipe into a tube and mail it off, and they can detect the amount of dust that's in that tube from that square and calculate how much lead dust is in your home. I will just let you know that in my home, we did have a stained glass window you can see in that photo that had lead. However, this was 10 feet off the ground and outside of his view, and we decided to let the window stay there. Most people are not licking stained glass windows. I did find a bunch of old jewelry, some costume jewelry. One of them was actually the band I wore on my wedding day that had high levels of lead on it. And some of this was children's jewelry and children's stuff that they were playing with, and sometimes kids put things in their mouth. So I threw most of that away. Didn't want to risk it as an exposure for any of the kids. Although again, was not the case for my 1-year-old. I was not giving my 1-year-old little toy gems to suck on. Our dust samples were actually positive, but only near the doorways to the outside, which was our first hint to where this might be coming from. So then we started looking around outside. You can see in this photo, that was our backyard patio. And this is somewhere that my son liked to crawl around on a lot. We spent a lot of time outside that summer. And so I pointed to the ground and asked them to sample the soil. And the soil in the yard was negative, but we did have, you can see from the red circles there, very, very high levels of lead in the soil and in the patio bricks themselves. And it seemed to be on the rocks themselves as well, although again, lead should not be in that high concentration on the lead rocks. I was told by the CDC team that if we wanted to plant a garden right where our walk was, it would not be safe to eat the vegetables out of that garden. That is how high the lead levels were in the soil there. And so I had a very unusual case of lead poisoning from our patio. I still have not figured out exactly who built it and who did this patio, but having spoken to many contractors and landscapers, we suspect there was some sort of spray or sealant used on top of the patio and the walkway, and it coated everything in that area in lead. Luckily not the rest of the yard, but just that original patio that was built by the original owners. So, what did we do in my case? We avoided our backyard completely. It was an extensive patio covering at least half the backyard. And sure enough, when we tested him a month later and then 3 months later, his levels went from 7 down to 5, down to 3. So his lead poisoning was gone just within a few months. And because I wanted to be able to use my yard again, we did save up the funds and installed a new patio and walkway in that area so we could use our yard again without having to worry about lead poisoning. However, not all families have the resources to replace their entire patio. It should be noted that Medicaid patients have double the cases and double the lead levels as non-Medicaid patients. Here's a graph in the 1980s you can see where there is much higher levels, and it's gotten better. Again, we have gotten it out of gasoline, gotten it out of paint, and we are having reduced numbers of cases of lead poisoning, but there absolutely still is a discrepancy. It really is a disparate burden. And you can imagine if you are of low socioeconomic status and you are living in an impoverished situation and there is lead paint on the walls and then you get lead poisoning from that, now you are more susceptible to having criminal behavior, of being unable to get the money to get a good job, to remediate your home, or to get to a better home that doesn't have lead poisoning. So you can see it's a self-fulfilling prophecy where people can get stuck in this loop. Let's talk about what various states are doing about this. So in the state of New Hampshire, as an example of a New England state that does universal screening, you can see that their screening levels have been pretty regularly above 70% for their 1-year-old age. In the year 2022, 77% of their kids were screened. And New Hampshire's a smaller state, but even at 77% screened, that was over 1,000 kids who had a lead level greater than 3.5. Now that's still leaving out, as you can think, 23% were not even being screened. And that fluctuates from year to year and from state to state. Now, we do know that we can increase screening rates. These are the screenings that are happening in your doctor's office at the age of 1 and 2. If we make it people more publicly aware, that's some of the point of this lecture, is letting you know the importance of lead screening and trying to get this done universally in our states. And then also offering it in the office. I almost didn't get my son tested and missed his case. He would have had a few years of lead poisoning from our patio, and maybe he would have had ADHD and I just would have thought it was him. So trying to get that test actually in the office where people are less likely to say, oh, it's a bother. Oh, I got to go downstairs. Oh, I got to, make an appointment at the lab next week and not get it done. That happens all the time. And getting a office test available increases screening rates significantly. But I would like to note, and this is mostly from Vermont data, which I used to live there as well, we are missing at least 58% of cases, even in New Hampshire or in Maine, because a lot of these states are only tracking and watching levels that are greater than 3.5. Vermont is one of the few states that actually tracks kid levels all the way down to 0. So they will report out a 0.2 or a 0.5 or a 1. And again, they are finding double the amount of cases with a lead level between 0 to 3.5 as they are a level of 3.5 and above. So we're missing 58% of kids by not looking under 3.5 in the states that are choosing not to do that. Some other facts about screening in the United States. Again, this is from the Vermont data. When you look at all the kids with any level of lead that are detected, it's estimated that 18% of 1-year-olds in the state of Vermont have some level of lead detected in their body. And although Vermont is an old state with old housing, it is not the only old state with old housing. If you recall that map from earlier in the presentation, there are many, many states with old housing stock. And so we are missing a huge amount of lead poisoning in the United States. Again, up to 20% of our kids, 18% of our kids. When you actually look at states that don't have universal screening, their screening rates are much lower, 20, 25, 30% at most, which means they're missing 70 to 75% of kids. So most states in the United States are not actually screening most of their 1 and 2-year-olds. In the state of Illinois, for example, 75% of kids are not being screened. This, I think, is a strong case for why we should advocate for universal testing. All 1 and 2-year-olds nationwide should be tested, and we will detect many, many more cases and be able to intervene, find the source of the lead poisoning, and prevent some brain damage. Now, again, this is a very pediatric heavy talk right now, but adult cases absolutely do matter too. Although they are not as common and not absorbed as much, we should be tracking those cases. And actually, out of our 50 states, only 37 states are participating in tracking adult lead levels. 13 of them don't track them at all. And several of those states that do track it are only tracking lead levels greater than 25. That's actually from some old Occupational Safety Administration numbers where they intervene if an adult has a case greater than 25. But again, if you think of the current data, lead levels above 1.5 are shown to have damage. We should not only be intervening and tracking for lead levels greater than 25, we should be tracking all of these numbers. But of course, it's a matter of funding and regulations, which I know are limited in all governments. But although testing is very important, it won't actually solve the problem. Most of the lead poisoning crisis is from housing. The vast majority of lead poisoning still does come from lead paint. And so we need to be thinking about ways to remediate this housing stock so it doesn't poison family after family after family anymore. Public health policy really is key here. Although it would be great if we could all get the lead poisoning and try to find it case by case, if you think about it, it doesn't make sense to wait for a kid to get poisoned in order to deal with it. This is one of the only medical screening tests I can think of where we wait for the kid to get hurt before we try to do something to prevent it. If you look at where kids get poisoned, again, most of it is lead paint and housing, 70%, but increasing in numbers, especially in states where there is a lot of newer housing stock like Arizona. It could be lead in consumer products. These are lead paints from overseas toys made in China. It could be the applesauce that we mentioned, all of those examples I gave at the beginning of the presentation. And although it's 15% on this slide, again, in a state like Arizona, it's actually much higher. It can also be in your drinking water, in your soil. So how do we take care of this? A lot of this needs to be public health policy. Remediation of housing, whether that be local initiatives, grants to high-risk areas, tax deductions, regulations. This is where big government could actually help a lot at a public health policy level. We also need more regulations for universal testing. If we tested all 1 and 2-year-olds, we'd be able to prevent a lot of lead poisoning cases in the United States. There have been many studies looking at the economic scale of this, and the money that goes into testing these kids would be more than gained back by the less criminal behavior, less conduct disorders, less behavioral health specialists that are needed to care for depressed patients, anxious patients, developmentally delayed patients, etc. We need to do policies like the one that just happened in New Hampshire, where the state mandated that all public water fountains were tested, and they found a significant amount of lead poisoning that was happening of these preschools, and actually all public schools. These kind of policies do make a difference. But public health initiatives are slow. Having entered this world the last few years, I can tell you I have changed very little in the states that I've visited so far, other than just education. And so while we're waiting for policy, you can put this into your own hands and try to find what you're being exposed to right now. There are some new products on the market. This FluoroSpec is a very handy one that actually helped me do a secondary sweep of my home and find some areas near the foundation of my house and yard that the CDC had missed on their testing. You can see from this picture, it's made of a product where you can spray it, and then if you shine their UV light on it, it glows green if it's lead, and it does not change colors if it's not lead. And so rather than buying a very expensive lead check stick, which I was using very sparingly and couldn't test a lot of places, you get over 100 sprays per bottle. So I could spray quite a bit and find all the lead very rapidly. It was very helpful for my home's case. Here's a picture of where I found it in my home that, again, the CDC had missed. You can see it was actually sprayed on the base of my house and near my foundation, and is still there despite me remediating the walkway. So we just stay away from that gravel area. I found it on an old play gym that we had gotten. You can see that the rubber coating on the handles that the kids climb on the swing set has worn off, and that bar underneath, shining bright green, is unfortunately lead. And I found it in some dishware as well that I have since gotten rid of. Again, that we missed with other stuff and we can catch with a product like this. So what I want you to get from this talk, you know a lot more about lead poisoning now, but the next step I want you to do is to educate and spread the word. The most important thing you can do about lead poisoning is to, 1, know that there is no safe lead level, but 2, to avoid exposure. Even if you have already been exposed, the treatment is as simple as removing the exposure from the lead poisoned person. So we need to educate. One way that I do it in my office is I hand out this baby board book. I am a family medicine doctor, which means I take care of adults and kids. So anytime I see one of my pediatric patients, I hand them this lead-free, happy, healthy, lead-free me book. And it starts a good talk about lead poisoning and why it's important for them to get screened at the visit. You can order one of these at leadfree.me. It's sold at cost. They're not trying to make a profit off of this book. There is, of course, a ton of information from the CDC where you can educate yourself and others. There are social media accounts, people very invested in lead, trying to learn about it. There's a lot of education and media online. Eric Everything Lead is a great resource as well. Eric Everything Lead has a great website with some humorous and real-life examples of where lead can be found, and is trying to get the word out as well with this talk. And also just talking to your friends and colleagues. The case with the coffee table that poisoned the 1-year-old, that was, again, just spreading the word. A friend of a friend knew that I knew something about lead poisoning, and she reached out and I helped her find that coffee table example, where her level was low enough that the CDC wasn't necessarily going to get involved, but we were able to give her kids and her family the gift of not having further lead exposure. So again, we do not have to wait for public health policy, although we certainly should be striving for that and voting for that. Education and spreading the word. If we can avoid the lead exposure, we can get the lead out of our environment and out of our kids and out of our families. And those are my references. And I hope you learned something from today's talk, and I hope that you go into the world and make sure that you're not having any lead exposures in your home or in your life, and let somebody know what you learned about today. Thank you for listening.